We will start with a session of one-to-one interviews, actually, that will focus on understanding the economics of connectivity and location to enable optimized water usage. And yesterday we had a session dedicated for water economics, and which is, of course, a very important issue. And I will leave it for the session moderator, Mr. Kshitij Nilkanth, who's the program manager of the environmental technologies for the MENA and South Asia region from Frost & Sullivan. Kshitij, may I give you the floor, and I will leave it for you to introduce your panelists.
Thank you very much, Mr. Faraj. And good morning and welcome everybody to this interview session on understanding of the economics of connectivity and location to enable optimized water usage. Today we have a very eminent panel representing the industry, the water authorities, and also the technology company. I would first like to welcome Dr. Klaus Konzelmann, Vice President, Safety, Health and Environment at Nestlé, Mr. Adam Lovell, Executive Director, Water Services Association of Australia, and Mr. Glenn Trickle, Vice President and Director, Engineering and Technology, Xylem. Well, without wasting much time, we'd like to look at it from two perspectives. One is the economics of connectivity, and from that angle, I mean, with the Arab Gulf, most of the cities are coastal cities and benefiting from desalination. However, the inland cities could be connected, and my first question is to Mr. Glenn Trickle. How is it feasible to connect inland cities based on the energy requirement that desalination itself poses, and the connection and transmission costs may increase the cost of water overall?
Thank you, Kshitij. I think we all know that there's a significant amount of energy required to move the water great distances relative to desal, but I think part of the practical answer is if you don't have water where you need it, you'll move it, right? So I think a big portion of trying to look at that is the overall solution space in terms of trying to balance the cost to move the water, but look at it as a system perspective. Yesterday, a number of people talked about increasing awareness to balance supply and demand and reuse water, but I think that's one part of the solution. But there's a lot of emphasis and focus on looking at the transportation network, and our customers ask us to really optimize energy usage and pumping. And I think a big portion of that we can talk about peak shaving and doing that in the most energy efficient way. So I think it is possible, but my suggestion would be to look at the overall macro problem.
Mr. Adam, would you like to share your experience in terms of how Australia has been dealing with water?
Sure.
Here?
And I think, you know, out of the Millennium Drought, the one thing that they did up in southeast Queensland was to build a grid. And they built that grid. They had the desalination plant down in Tugun, which is on the Gold Coast, and they stretched the grid right up to the Sunshine Coast, 200 kilometres away, and inland 100 kilometres to an indirect potable reuse facility and where the dam was. So that's a genuine grid, building in all the dams, indirect potable reuse and desalination. They've optimised that system, except that they don't use the indirect potable reuse because it started to rain, as I mentioned yesterday. But it's all there. It's there as a grid. It's optimised for energy use. And in fact, the irony was that when they built the desalination plant, of course it was built for drought purposes, but they've actually used it twice for flood purposes, because when it flooded, the traditional water treatment plants couldn't handle the load of silt. And so they turned the desalination plant on, put it into the grid, and that water actually reached 200 kilometres way up to the Sunshine Coast. It can work, and we've definitely got that ability to make it work.
And And also from a decentralized water resource management, which we were discussing out there, you were mentioning some of the examples of how sustainable water usage in private utilities in Australia, and if you could just elaborate on that and
Sure.
Tell us.
So say in a city like Sydney, which is coastal city, it's getting old now. You know, Sydney's been there since 1788. Certainly not as old as some other cities in the world, but certainly getting older. What we've found is that as some of those inner city areas, as they're gentrified, and they've taken out some of the old manufacturing warehouses, which were built for those days to store wool and things like that, they've built new buildings. And there's one which I'd encourage you to look up online. It's called Central Park. And this is actually off-grid. It's the water on site is not provided by Sydney Water. It's done by a private water utility. It's a fantastic residential and commercial complex which has recycled water on site, black water recycling, grey water recycling, rainwater harvesting, and it's provided by a private utility. The most exciting thing that I think it provides is the opportunity for energy and for waste to be provided by that single utility. Now, traditionally, my members of the big utilities, it's introducing innovation and competition to those customers. The most beautiful thing about this building, though, is it's got a beautiful, magnificent green wall. It's a 30-storey building, and that green wall is now slowly building. So we're looking at the heat island effect and how that green wall might reduce the green island effect. So, plenty of exciting opportunities ahead.
Sure. So that's a good example for sustainable water use and decentralized systems. I would like my next question to go to Dr. Claus. From a local sustainable ecosystem point of view, Nestle has been working a lot on water footprint and embedded water, being the largest food company in the world. Would you like to share some of your initiatives and thoughts on the subject?
Right, yes, with pleasure. In fact, Nestle is probably, indirectly at least, one of the top water users in the world. Right. Not so much in our own facilities. We've got about 500 factories around the world that obviously do consume water. Even so, we have reduced water consumption in our factories by 65% per dollar turnover over the last 10 years. So we have originally taken had a lot of focus in improving our water efficiencies in our own factories. We just a couple of months ago inaugurated, in fact, our first zero water facility in Mexico, in the Jalisco region there, which is marked by extreme water scarcity and water stress. Why are we actually able even to completely separate from the grid there? What we're doing in that factory is we're making milk powder. And if you make milk powder, you start with liquid milk, and liquid milk contains more than 80% water. So rather than in the past separating the water from the milk solids, the milk powder, and then treating that water and rejecting it as wastewater, we have really now some sophisticated recycling processes internally, which means that we don't really need any additional water from the grid. So not a good business for the water utilities, obviously, there in that area. We're actually even replenishing the local watersheds with the water indirectly that we are collecting from the farmers. But I think that's really the key point there, that we've learned over the last few years that obviously we had to start by putting our own house in order and by focusing on water efficiencies in our own factories. But that's literally, and excuse the pun, a drop in the much bigger bucket. We are using today less than 3 liters of water per every kilo of food product we make on average, which is down from more than 8 liters per kilo about 10 years ago. But if we look at the water used by our suppliers, by agriculture in particular, that is orders of magnitudes more. That can be anything up to a few hundred, even a few thousand liters per kilogram of raw materials. So if we just look at our own factories and ignore the farming sector, which uses globally 70% of all the fresh water for irrigation, then we would miss a big point. And there we've been in the fortunate position that already for many decades, we've been employing more than 1,000 agronomists around the world in order to provide technical assistance to farmers in order to help them to produce higher quality raw material, which is again in our business interest, because if we've got higher quality agricultural raw material, that means it's easier for us to make high quality food products. And we've now extended the task of this network of agricultural advisors and extension workers to also advise farmers on a more responsible, more sustainable use of water in terms of better irrigation techniques, drip irrigation, and so on. So that's really the area we've been expanding, and how we also learned that water is an issue that you cannot solve alone, even if we make our factories extremely water efficient, even if we, as that one example shows, and there are other ones to follow in the next few years that are in the pipeline, that will not solve the water issue, because it will eventually mean that with the very dropping water tables which we see all around the world in the areas where we source raw materials, if those farmers don't have water anymore to irrigate their crops, we will not have the raw materials needed to support our business. And we are now almost 150 years old. Our business model is based, we're not really benefiting from water one way or another directly commercially, but our interest is we want to be a successful company also in the next 150 years, and that is our motivation. Why, for example, also our chairman, Peter Brabeck, today, the World Economic Forum is opening in Davos, where for more than 10 years he has raised the water issue in that forum, and they have just last week produced their annual report, where water has topped the list in the 10th edition of their global risks report, and saying that there was a shift over the past few years away from economic risks to general environmental risks, ranging from climate change, in particular to the water crisis. So I think it's a discussion that's no longer just targeted and confined to these kind of sustainability conferences, but it's on the top of the agenda of the world leader, such as the ones currently also coming together in Davos in Switzerland.
Sure. Right. I'll quickly move on to, considering the time limitation that we have, about the water pricing. You know, we heard a lot about it yesterday's panel discussions. Overall, there's a broad consensus on putting a price to water. Even Abu Dhabi introducing water tariffs from 1st of January. Mr. Glenn, what is your take on the water pricing and the policies around it as such?
I think the main thing is it's part of a mindset change and an education of the public. I think when we did our Value for Water survey in 2012, most people realized that one of the outcomes, I think, from that discussion was people were willing to pay more for water to realize the value that is embedded in that water. So I think part of this is just one of the levers or one of the pieces that goes into building customer awareness. There obviously is pushback, but I think ultimately a fair price for water is something we need to support, because we all know the tremendous pressures on our infrastructure with urbanization, coastal migration, increasing water use. This is just one of the first starting points to build that awareness.
I would like Mr. Adam to comment, because we've seen some water pricing reforms in Australia, and resulting in reduced water consumption per capita, so as such.
Yeah, and in some cities you've seen prices go up 300% in 5 years, so that's a significant, significant. It's still around 2.5 to 2.9% of household disposable income, so not as much as people might spend on cable TV or things like that, but it's certainly growing, and it's certainly growing in terms of people's awareness of what they're paying for utilities overall, energy included. I think one of the things that our customers in Australia have got used to this idea that to build a diversified portfolio of water supplies, there's an insurance risk that's built into that, and there's insurance cost that must be built in. And so they've accepted that. It's not come easily, of course, because some of those huge spikes in prices are certainly hit the hip pocket. But people understand that when you're in a climate-challenged environment, you have to have that insurance built in behind you. You have to have that diversified water supply. And part of the levers I talked about yesterday is pricing, it's water efficiency, and it's all the manufactured water sources that you have to hand.
Sure. It will be interesting to get your perspective, Dr. Claus, on the pricing of water.
Yes, I mean, as I said, we're probably one of the world's biggest water users, both directly and indirectly. So if the price for water goes up, we will be economically quite impacted by it. And typically, business doesn't like to have higher input costs. Nevertheless, we are very, very strong advocates of more appropriate pricing of water, because we see some absolutely outrageous sort of pricing structures around the world, but very often in the areas of the world where water is scarcest, even we as industry pay least for it, which I think is completely unacceptable. And I think that exactly makes the difference between a company that just looks at short-term profitability, that obviously would like to do everything and lobby for lowest input costs, whereas we take again a much longer-term view, and we strongly believe that if water is not priced more appropriately, just the current wastage will continue. There will be no incentive for people to save water. In just my original home country, with Germany, to cite as an example, compared to water use here in the Gulf region, it's about 10 times more water per capita that is being used here, according to the statistics here of the UAE environmental department here. And I think a large part of that also has to do with pricing. So we very strongly advocate a much more appropriate price for water. Having said that, obviously being a private enterprise, we're obviously also often accused that we wanted to privatize water and take it away from society. Nothing could be far further from the truth, right to the contrary. I think a few years ago there was this kind of distinction made, or this unhealthy discussion whether water would be a human right, free for all, or whether it would be a commercial good. And I think it's typically one of those issues which is not an either or, but an and. Obviously water is a human right for the basic needs of hydration, for hygiene and so on, but is it a human right to fill up your swimming pool for free or to wash your car? I think people who can afford those kind of luxuries should pay appropriately for price, which again would even partly cross-subsidize water for those who currently even cannot afford it.
Right, I think, are there any questions from the audience? Because I'm not getting anything on my tab, so could we have a mic out there if anybody has any questions? Okay. Again, I'll come back to Mr. Glenn about, creating a sustainable water ecosystem. Xylem as a technology company has invested a lot in developing new technologies of reuse and recycling. Do you think a decentralized system could possibly be a good solution for largely, arid regions or even water scarce regions around the globe?
I think it is. We see that similar to what Adam had, for an example, where you'll see an apartment block locally reuse things. I think part of the important part of that discussion is to look at how we balance both the quality standard of what's produced, the cost, as well as kind of the environmental impact. I see a lot more discussions with our customers and key stakeholders around balancing, if you will, the life cycle cost, and a lot of the work more recently on life cycle assessment to understand the environmental impacts beyond greenhouse gas emissions in terms of eutrophication or acidification of lakes, aquatic or human ecotoxicity, in terms of trying to understand a more holistic view of balancing the human dimension, the cost dimension, and the environmental dimension when thinking about how to look at reuse and balancing that in the, if you will, the most optimal or best, quote unquote, solution for our customers. So I think that's really driving a lot of our research and thought leadership as to how do we put those three dimensions together.
Sure. Sure. So, I mean, overall, what I understand is there's a requirement for a more holistic, multifaceted approach, including all the stakeholders, whether it's industry, community, and the authorities, so to say, come together in a way to address this issue more locally or, even at a national level. So it's great to have you on this panel, and thanks for all the insights from your experience. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you.